got a real simple question for you. Could you give us your thoughts on where capitalism is going in the future and where value can be created in the future?
Where capitalism is going and where...
In the future, can capitalism be sustained?
Yeah. With specific reference to the internal contradictions of capitalism?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I prefer to try to separate out the techno-economic structure known as industrialization from that known as capitalism, because they both tended historically to rise at about the same time, and they're often kind of confused. And criticisms of one that you know actually just apply to one and not to both of them. And it's helpful to kind of tease those apart and say, okay, this is what industrialization is doing, and this is what capitalism is doing, and you know, what's the future of each of those? If a significant portion of humanity makes it to second tier, I believe economics will not be able to go forward without taking into account the interiors. And I think it's a mistake to start referring to that as human capital, because it too quickly gets into flatland capital and the whole moving around of material goods that constitutes so much of economics. It's become unbelievably clear that standard economic theory, whether it includes capitalism or not, that standard economic theory has to have some assumption about what pushes people around. And so the most common one is that the human beings act in rational self-interest to maximize their gain. And that's a wacky assumption, because nobody is rational and very few people know what their self-interest is. So it's the way economists say, I don't know what the hell they're doing, but let's assume this. Because they can't get material goods and services moved around by themselves. Artifacts don't move by themselves. Somebody pushes them, pulls them, buys them, sells them. So what you're really doing is dealing with this whole interior dimension that simply has not really been taken into account very well. And so even if you look at something like Amory and Lover, and Hunter Lovins, I'm sorry, on natural capitalism, where they're trying to sort of give a different face to it, it turns out to be entirely lower right quadrant explanations without really understanding interior motivations. I'll give you a really quick example, again, using spiral dynamics. You can say, well, we understand flowcharts of traffic patterns in downtown Manhattan. And so that gives us we just look at the way cars move, and we can make mathematical equations and economic equations governing what goes here and what goes here and so on. But what they can't tell you is whether the drivers of those cars are red or blue or orange or green or yellow. Now, clearly that really makes a difference in the long run in terms of the goods and services that human beings exchange. The only levels of development that start to become self-reflexive enough to insist on putting that into economics starts with green, blossoms with yellow, and is an absolute unavoidable event at turquoise. So by the time we get to turquoise economics, it's going to be a four-quadrant economics by whatever other name. I don't believe there's any other way around it. I think the data really supports that. What that's going to look like is going to be fascinating. I think absolutely fascinating, because you're going to have a whole nother bottom line, shall we say. And I even kind of resist using that term, because, but since we can say there's a bottom line for all four quadrants. And those will be taken into account, and that's what's going to be so amazing. Now, the question is whether we get there. Because it's a horse race, as far as I can tell, because 70% of the world's population is ethnocentric or lower. 70%. And if that's the case, if there isn't some understanding about that, and not in a judgmental way, just this is if you take the motivations of ethnocentric people, and silly, that when I'm talking about third world, we're talking about ethnocentric cutting across every country. Like ours, for example. I say this every time I do it, but Kansas outlawed the teaching of evolution again. Again, the second time in a year. And what happens is, bless their hearts, but those little blue memes, they're out there, and the Supreme Court kind of looks this way and is doing something, and everybody's kind of, and then Kansas outlaws the teaching of evolution and all this other stuff, and then the Supreme Court says, hey, what was that? I saw that, and then they have to put it back, and then they wait, If we had one person, one vote democracy, a nightmare. So we have to be very careful about that. So it's not just 70% down in those countries. It's 70% in our country, and it cuts across like that. Everybody has a right to be at whatever stage of development they're at. But the whole point about modern representative democracies is that the laws that govern them come from orange or higher. And that you agree that when you are in the public arena, you will behave according to orange laws. You don't have to believe them. In the privacy of your own home, you can believe Jesus Christ is the only Savior, and that if you don't believe in Jesus, you'll fry in hell. But in the public sphere, unfortunately, you can no longer burn at the stake people who disagree with you. And that's the agreement you make here. Now, if we have one person, one vote, oh, look out, because they're going to be warming the stake up for us. We are Kansas barbecue, as far as I can tell. I swear. So, but we were talking about economics. The horse race right now is between, honestly, I think that's 70%. And then those that are world-centric or higher. Because those that world-centric or higher extend equal rights to everybody. And those that ethnocentric don't. It's just that simple. And so that's what we have to be really careful about. But if we do get a percentage continuing to move in those directions, I think economics as a discipline is going to be just dramatically, re-understood. And I think there will be other monetary configurations coming out that represent these exchanges. There's nothing wrong with having a marketplace where we all go and meet, and we say, I've got this good and I've got this services, and I'm a massage person and I have medicine. So there's nothing wrong with the market per se. But we've always understood that there were you can't have just a free market and let anything go, because we're not allowed to sell human beings in the marketplace, for example. Well, not unless that 70% takes over. So once we start putting all of those factors in, I think it's really going to change. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Industrialization as a mode of production will, I think, continue in limited ways and environmentally scrubbed. I mean, clean to the extent it can be. There's always something that, it can do that information technologies can't do and that farming can't do. And the same way we still have to have farming. See, that's the extraordinary thing in the lower right. If you look at all of the modes of techno-economic production, we need all of them. And we kind of forget that, because the people that are farming are also outlawing evolution. They're out in those states doing agrarian modes, and agrarian modes tend to go with mythic beliefs. That's kind of how they... So we have to kind of watch it, but we can't do without it. So that's what I love about all these things, is you can't just say one is good and one is bad. All of them are required. That's the extraordinary thing about this integral complex that we're all in. So, so industrialization reduces capitalism. Part of what you have to look at, and this is a very delicate issue, and and emotions get inflamed, and I understand this. But to the extent that there is a kind of eros to evolution, to the extent that there's kind of a growing tip, to the extent that some people first pushed into world-centric morality, which is better than ethnocentric morality, to the extent that that happens, past societies have usually found crude ways that growing tip could get together and do what it was doing. Now, it almost always had very unpleasant shadow sides, but it was almost always there. And aristocracy, for example, and the king's court was is the only place where very few people could actually get an education. It was the only place where arts and sciences flourished. We of today would like to see it more democratic, but it couldn't be that way at the beginning. It was concentrated. But then usually what happens with evolution is the things that were first given in just that concentrated amount tend to get dispersed and spread out, and everybody tends to benefit. Capital, the accumulation of capital, was a kind of aristocratic accumulation of intellectual means that transcended labor. And so to that extent, it was its own little aristocracy trying to push out and do something new. The downside is that because capital can be like an artifact, like a gun or something, idiots can get their hands on it. And most capital is now owned by idiots. You must have noticed this. So the critique of capitalism has to be teased apart from the critique of it can get concentrated in the hands of the undeserving just because it's an artifact. And that's always a critique that we have to take seriously. But without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that it was that attempt to transcend mere labor. And then whenever you get into critiques like Marx that have a labor theory of value, then it ends up reducing it right back down, and nobody believes in the labor theory of value anymore. So, okay?